if Putin, as we think, is allowed to keep territory, Xi Jinping's going to be doing a calculation as to whether it's worth his while taking Taiwan by force, and can he suffer the wrath of the international community for the 3 years or 4 years it would take. I think he's made that calculation and will probably go for it.
Philip Ingram, thank you for being with us today. This has been a pretty tough day for Ukrainians.
Yeah.
Trump, Putin, they're going to start those talks immediately. We had those bombshell comments from Pete Hegseth yesterday in Brussels. How do you think this is going down in the Kremlin and in Moscow?
I think Putin has got a big smile on his face and is seeing this as positive. You know, what are we seeing here? We're seeing him engaging and being treated as a world leader by Trump. That's what Putin wants. We're seeing Trump arranging a meeting with him. Well, Putin has got an international arrest warrant out against him, and Trump is giving him a degree of credibility to allow him back into the international fold. So Putin sees this as an opportunity to exploit and get what he wants in Ukraine, to try and extricate himself from the war with saving some face, and to set a path for him being back into the international community and accepted as a global leader again. So for Putin, he's seeing this as win-win-win.
So we're rehabilitating Putin. Militarily, does this perhaps help him as well?
It does if it gives him breathing space, because Putin will have learned huge lessons from his conflict in Ukraine. You know, he has been adapting his tactics. He's been adapting new technologies and all the rest of it very rapidly the whole way through. And he will take that and he will use that to regenerate Russian military capability, bigger, better, stronger than we've seen beforehand. Now, this is from Putin's perspective. Putin's saying very much what he wants. I think there's a very complex game being played here, and we're analysing it from a 2D perspective, and this is 3D, 4D, 5D, 6D chess that's going on. So I think a lot of the analysis of what's going on at the moment may not be in the right ballpark, but that's what Putin will be thinking.
From the British perspective, the UK Defence Secretary says no talks about Ukraine without Ukraine being involved, going against exactly what Putin and what Trump have said. Is peace being agreed over Ukraine's head here?
Well, it could be. And, if we look back at Donald Trump in his previous incarnation as president, whenever it came to dealing with the Taliban and Afghanistan, he didn't include wider players in his decision to withdraw US troops and to do deals with the Taliban. So he's got a history of this. And this is why he makes international leaders, I will be diplomatic here and say, nervous, because he's unpredictable. And what they don't like is unpredictability. And this is why, if you look at all of the comments that are coming out from all the senior leaders around the world, they're all very positive. They're all very pro what the President Trump is doing and everything else, because they don't want to upset him, because his unpredictability can be emotionally driven at times.
As you say, we're getting mostly positive statements, but also some conflicting ones. There's a seeming element of pushback coming. We see Healy's comments about no negotiations without Ukraine. Sweden saying we can't rule out membership of NATO for Ukraine.
Yes.
What do you think is going on behind the scenes in defence ministries across Europe today?
I think there's panic, and in particular across Europe and in the UK. And if there isn't panic in the UK, then they're getting it wrong. Because for too many years, and this is you boil it down to Trump approaches things from a business perspective. Why should I pay more than other people and why should I pay to look after you when you're not paying to look after yourself effectively? We saw him do that in his first incarnation when he insisted that all NATO members meet their commitment of 2% of GDP on defence. Not all do. And he's doing effectively the same now. He's saying, Europe's your problem. We've got bigger fish to fry at home and other places. So you step up. For too many years, Europe has relied on US might to deter any attacks against it. And he's called it out. And European leaders are suddenly going, all of our economic planning, all of our economic plans have been thrown out the window. And in the UK, we've got a strategic defence review coming up. That was given an answer before it started of 2.5% of GDP. Now work out how we get there at some stage whenever the Chancellor says we can do it. Well, the reality is coming out, it's minimum of 3%, and we need to be on a path to 5%. Otherwise, Trump is going to look at putting additional sanctions, whether they be overt or under-the-table sanctions, against nations that aren't doing that. And it's clear with John Healey leading the contact group yesterday and chairing it for the first time that Trump sees the UK as stepping up and leading Europe and where Europe's going. We need to do that with what we're spending on defence, first and foremost.
We've had that mood music of Europe needs to look after itself, needs to shoulder the burden, as it's been put. This was put out much more explicitly than it ever has before, I think, yesterday. Can Europe afford it? And can it provide the kind of security guarantees that Hegseth mentioned to guarantee to keep peace in Ukraine?
Can Europe afford it? You put Europe together, and it's got a GDP bigger than the United States. So, the United States is spending $900 billion on defence. Now, it's looking Atlantic and it's looking Pacific at the same time, with Pacific being the biggest focus. And the US is only spending 3.2% of its GDP on defence. So, Europe, yes, it can afford it if countries want to do that. But most European countries don't, because they see defence as dead expenditure. And when you've got American security guarantees, why do we need to spend money on defence? Well, they've just been called out now, and now is the time to sit up and wake up. Poland has recognised it, and Pete Hegseth mentioned Poland in particular. But Poland has got a smaller defence budget than the UK. They've just bought 1,000 tanks, 1,000 artillery pieces. We haven't even got a battery of 24 self-propelled artillery pieces on tracks. We're only converting 148 Challenger 2 to Challenger 3. We're getting things badly wrong. And there needs to be a root and branch review of how we approach defence, and there needs to be more money spent on it, because Putin's not going to stop. And if Putin, as we think, is allowed to keep territory, Xi Jinping's going to be doing a calculation as to whether it's worth his while taking Taiwan by force, and can he suffer the wrath of the international community for the 3 years or 4 years it would take. I think he's made that calculation and will probably go for it.
We've had a generation of not spending as much on defence since the end of the Cold War, perhaps more than a generation now. Does the prospect of, given the political situation in Germany, in France, even here in Britain, does this perhaps threaten the unity of NATO at the end of the day?
I think some of the comments that Pete Hegseth came out with did threaten the unity of NATO, and there'll be a coalition of the willing within NATO. He took away the automatic US guarantee of support. He said, the European continent is yours to look after. He didn't say the US weren't going to contribute. Even when it comes to Ukraine, he said not take the lead, not put troops on the ground. A lot of what we rely on from the United States is backroom activity, intelligence, logistics support, air support, and other things. So that hasn't been ruled out in any of the comments that are there. It's the ground troops, and I think this is Trump forcing Europe to step up and meet its responsibilities, and it can do, and that's good for European economies, because you tend to spend defence on in companies that are in your own country. And if you're doing that, you're spending your own taxpayers' money, investing it back in your country, creating more jobs, creating more high-tech jobs, creating more requirement for people to be trained to meet those high-tech jobs. And if you get your manufacturing output right, you could sell it around the world. Putin's arms industry around the world has died. He's been shown how bad it is. There's an opportunity there. But none of our governments seem to be sitting up and going, we'll take this.
Thinking back to your comments about Trump as being a master negotiator at times, is there an argument perhaps that by ruling out the use of Article 5 in Ukraine, by ruling out NATO membership for NATO, by explicitly saying no 2014 borders, you don't get Crimea back, is this revealing his negotiating position before the starting flag even waves?
I don't think so. I think he's smarter than that. If we look at the plan that Zelenskyy went to Trump with before Trump was inaugurated, Zelensky's plan had Russia retaining some of the territory to be brought back into Ukraine by diplomatic negotiations afterwards. So Trump may be just pushing out Zelensky's plan in what's going on in there. And again, we have to recognise what is being said openly is not necessarily what's going on behind closed doors, and is not necessarily the where any end solution is going to be with all of this. There's an awful lot to go into it, an awful lot of negotiations, and at the moment, Trump is playing Putin because Putin's got as big an ego. He's playing Zelenskyy. Zelenskyy is monitoring what's going on. Zelensky's playing Trump, and all of the other international leaders. Mark Rutte with NATO is playing Trump, and the other NATO leaders. John Healey from the UK is trying to you balance everything out. And when we've got everyone doing these dances around, it can look a bit strange whenever you're looking in and trying to work out what's going on. We have to wait, I think.
So it's coming back to your 4D chess argument again, I suppose. Tomorrow, President Zelenskyy meets J.D. Vance, the US Vice President. They'll clearly be positive and warm before the television cameras.
Yeah.
Behind the scenes, is that going to be warm and positive?
I think it will be warm and positive. The one thing that Zelensky's done, and if you look at ever since the war started 3 years ago, or restarted 3 years ago, he's played international leaders perfectly. He came into Westminster and talked of Churchill and talked of having cups of tea. He went to Germany and brought out German national emotions. He went to the States and did the same. He's a master orator. Because he comes from that sort of background. And therefore, I think he's going to say everything that the Trump team wants to hear in the right way, but have a clear message underneath. He's not going to let this guard slip on this.
Because at heart, he's fighting for the
national
existence
survival
of his country.
Yeah, exactly. He's fighting for national survival. And the reality is, he is fighting on our behalf for the protection of the rest of Europe. Trump, I think, is just fed up because he approaches everything from a business perspective. He's fed up with America having to pick up the bill every time something goes wrong around the world. And there are three major conflicts. There's Europe with Russia, Ukraine, there's the Middle East, and then there's Southeast Asia. And of all of them, and I've been assessing this for over 20 years, Southeast Asia is the most dangerous and would have greatest global implications. The Middle East is always there. We're having to deal with that. And Europe is something we need to be cognizant of. Why should we rely on the Americans to have to deal with all three? There needs to be some form of sharing the pain around. And this is where Trump has suggested before he was coming in through his campaign that he's going to hit Europe hard. He's now hitting Europe hard.
With your decades of experience, will we look back in another 25 years and say 2025 was a pivot point?
Yes, 100%. And I hope it's not the pivot point that I think it is, because we are ticking closer and closer to a global conflict.
Philip Ingram, thank you very much for being with us today.